Hello, everybody. I'm here today with an academic from Perth. His name is James Nuzzo. Hello, James.
Hi, Bettina. How are you?
I'm great. I'm very happy to have you here. Um, I've been following your work for a while now, and I thought somebody had the bright idea of bringing you on so people can meet you. So
All right.
you're working in exercise science, and I think what you're actually doing is doing your best to implode your career by taking on the feminists, which is a very dangerous activity. Do you realize that?
I do, and you know what? I'm happy to do it. The data is on our side, and I'm happy to stick by the data.
Yeah, well, I wish everybody thought like that, but obviously they don't. So essentially what you've been doing is writing a series of papers challenging the sort of ideology that's seeping into your discipline, as with most disciplines, the sort of constant claims that women are being badly done by and ignoring the health risks facing men. I first heard about you I stumbled across a podcast which described a little skirmish you'd had where you were publishing a letter challenging a group of there were predominantly Australian researchers from the University of New South Wales here in Sydney, and they'd written this appalling article. It was called Gender-Based Violence is a Blind Spot for Sport and Exercise Medicine Professionals. It's a bit of a mouthful there. But that was essentially claiming that sports and exercise professionals should be taking more notice of gender-based violence. Now, tell me about this and tell me how you got involved.
Yeah, well, they made the claim that all of exercise science, all the health professionals that work in it, all the academics had a blind spot toward gender-based violence. And of course, what they meant by that was only female victimization when it comes to intimate partner violence and so on. And you and I both know that data, and that's not what the data show. The data show fairly roughly equal rates of victimization when it comes to intimate partner violence between males and females, but they only presented one side of the story. So I corrected their one side of the story, particularly because what they were trying to do is to get other exercise scientists to include it in their educational programs.
Yeah, yeah. And so what you did was put together a letter, and along with Deborah Parney. Now, my regular supporters, viewers will know Deborah Parney. She's been doing very important work recently. She's been doing a PhD in UK, but working on male victims of coercive control, a big international survey documenting the experiences of these male victims. And also John Barry, who's from the Centre of Male Psychology. So you have these three authors. Now, what did your article say, your letter that you wrote to the publishers?
Yeah, so what we were doing is just pointing out that the bias was not actually within the field. It was within the authors themselves who refused to acknowledge male victimization in their paper. So what we did is we presented all of that evidence. So we referenced all of the classic meta-analyses and annotated bibliographies that show this. And then we created, within our short letter, it was basically a mini review of violence within sporting environments, because remember, this is published in an exercise and sports science journal. And we presented, I think there's 10 or 12 studies thus far in our field that have looked at violence within sporting environments. So this might be, for example, a coach that abuses their male or female athlete. And it turns out that data is very similar in terms of the intimate partner violence data, where you have relatively equal rates of male and female victimization.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a very good summary. I hope I'll be putting up references to these various articles so that people have a look at them. And so you said this, you prepare this letter and you send it off to the publishers of the journal. And what happened then?
Yeah, so I've published many letters in my career so far. I'm a big fan of letters to the editor, so I've been through this quite a lot. And very rarely do letters to the editor get sent out for peer review. But our letter, because it was on a controversial topic, got sent out for peer review. 3 peer reviewers reviewed our letter. But the good news, Bettina, is that all 3 appreciated the letter. They said that it needed to be published. They had a couple of minor suggestions to make it actually a bit stronger and better, which we took on board. And then it actually got sent back out to them again for their final approval. And then it got accepted on our end. And then it was up to the other group to try to respond to our letter, and they sort of failed to do that. It was a very delayed process. Eventually, our letter got out.
But the point both of us would make is this is in a whole range of different areas. This sort of propaganda is happening. We're seeing, this seeping in, this ideology, and everyone is parroting the right phrases, quoting the right research, ignoring anything that challenges that research. And here you found that happening in your own area.
Yeah, so because I am aware of men's health data and some of the various arguments in that space, when I saw that article published, I felt compelled in a way to respond to it, because I knew that most other people in my field would just have not any clue how off base these researchers really were. And that's when I got in contact with Deb Pawney and John Barry and said, maybe we can come together and write something. Sure enough, we were successful in getting it published. And I think that's, there's a lot of losses that are suffered in this battle, but that's a small little win, I think.
It's a major victory. And do you have any response? Any people contact you, or has it sunk without a trace?
No, the thing is, I think people in my field are just completely unaware of these sort of gender debates that are going on, and a lot of the feminist lies that get talked about. They're so narrowly focused on their niche topic within exercise that they don't know. They just have no idea.
Now, the sort of misrepresentation you're talking about, which is, or only presenting the research that shows women as victims, girls as victims, and males as perpetrators, they're talking about that as gamma bias. Can you just explain that term and where it comes from?
Yeah, so gamma bias is a term that was put together by John Barry, who we mentioned earlier, and Martin Seeger, both in the UK. And the idea with gamma bias is it's a cognitive distortion or a form of a cognitive bias where female issues are magnified and male issues are minimized. And you can see this both within actual experimental psychology work in the lab, for example, but you can also see it at kind of a institutional or organizational level as well.
And one of your research papers, which shows this sort of bias you've been discussing, is actually, if you like, addressing what the UN is doing and WHO. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so this is an example of demonstrating this at sort of the institutional or organizational level. I had just been seeing so many things coming out of the UN that clearly had a feminist bend to them. The United Nations has the organization within it called UN Women. There is no UN Men organization to talk about boys and men's issues. And UN Women just puts out a ton of rubbish, so many different reports and tweets. And so I was getting a bit sick of this and thought someone needed to point it out because, of course, the UN relies in part on taxpayer dollars. So I went through and found a way to quantify their bias, which was just going through all of their various reports, their Twitter accounts, and just kind of quantifying the number of days of observation that they have for girls and women versus boys and men. And there's just huge differences across the board. So that's an example of sort of the institutional form of what we might call gamma bias.
Yeah, absolutely. You may, I don't know whether you know about DAVIA, which is the Domestic Abuse and Violence International Alliance. That's a group of now 125 different organizations across the world who are working to address the way domestic violence is being dealt with, the distortions and the way ideology is infiltrating and distorting proper research and proper discussion of results in this area. And interestingly, they are currently running a campaign to defund the UN. They've been having a very solid go at this, exactly what you're talking about, the incredible constant propaganda presenting women as the only victims. And now the other thing I thought was interesting, one of the other areas you've written about, is the claims of underrepresentation of female participants in research studies generally. Can you tell me about that?
So this has been a narrative going on for a few decades now. Basically, the idea is that within research trials that we conduct, there's an underrepresentation of female participants. Yeah. This has also come into the exercise and sports science world recently. And so the idea is that, according to the people that publish commentaries on this topic, is that sex discrimination or bias against women or a lack of interest in women's issue is what causes this underrepresentation of female participants. But there's more to the story. So one part of the story actually is that if you go and look at the actual representation data, it's not how it's always presented to you when they say that females are underrepresented. It depends on how you look at that data. But also, the participants themselves have to be accounted for. And what I mean by that is if you survey men and women about their interest and willingness to participate in research, there are sex differences. And we recently published a survey about willingness to participate in exercise studies. And we found significant numbers of sex differences where men were much more likely to want to be tested on different things, like of their muscle power and vertical jump and sprint ability, things like this, completing exercise tests until exhaustion, things that involve challenge and competition. And women were much more considerate of the decision process. So they were much more concerned about the potential side effects, the anxiety they might feel during testing, the pain or discomfort of the procedures. So we have documented that it's not all about discrimination or bias against women. The participants themselves kind of self-select out of different types of experiments. Yeah.
No, I know. I thought that was fascinating. But as you say, you don't hear that, do you? It's always presented in terms of, women are being discriminated against. They're not being asked to participate in these various research studies, et cetera, et cetera. I just want to go back a bit and tell people a bit more about you. How did you get into this whole field in terms of exercise science?
Yeah, how it all got started, me getting into men's health and sex differences, was the American College of Sports Medicine, which is the major exercise science organization in the U.S. Their diversity and equity committee published a sort of consensus statement just as I was finishing up my PhD in 2016 or 17. And it was all about creating equity in physical activity. And what this means is that when you do survey level research of populations, you find that when you split people by demographic categories, not all demographic groups have the same participation rates. And one of the differences that exists is between men and women. So men on the average tend to be more physically active. So therefore, they concluded that in order to create what they call health equity, like equal health outcomes or something, that you need to create physical activity equity because your health will improve if you're more physically active. So they published a paper that was about creating equity and focused on girls and women. And I said, wait a minute. First of all, even if your goal is to create equal health outcomes, you have just completely ignored the life expectancy gap that exists between men and women in the US, which is about 6 years. So there is a whole bunch of issues with that whole movement and ignoring the life expectancy gap. And that particular paper and that exchange I had in the literature is what kind of propelled me on toward the sex differences research.
Yeah. I mean, how successfully have you imploded your career, do you think? I mean, do you have to survive all of this? You're an Edith Cohen in Perth at the moment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, here's the thing, Bettina. I get all sorts of personal messages and emails. People message me on Twitter, personal, private messages, of course. Very, very few actually say anything publicly. But I know that I have support from certain types of people. And to be honest, those are the people who I want to have support from. I don't care other people who are not very good researchers and don't know how to interpret a graph or data. I don't really care to have their support. But the people that contact me, those are people that I respect, and I'm just going to keep going along those lines, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah, well, good luck. You're also branching out. You've got a Substack. I'll put the address of that below this video. And actually, I wanted to mention your latest blog, which is really interesting, about the martyrs of medicine, talking about all these doctors who have subjected themselves to whatever it was they were researching, and some, significant number of them have died in the process. Do you want to just say something quickly about that?
Yeah, the title of the blog. So it's a hybrid blog and podcast. So you can find me reading the blogs as well. It's called Men, the Martyrs of Medicine, and it actually ties back to this idea of female underrepresentation in research trials. So one thing that people seem to forget is that early medical research, and a lot of research, is risky. It's less risky now because we've got more practice at doing it and we understand the human body better. But in previous decades, even exercise research would have been considered risky. It's only because of people submitting themselves to experimentation in exercise research have we learned that exercise is actually safe and good for you. But in previous generations, it was thought it was dangerous. So those that sort of decry or say misrepresentation or underrepresentation, they seem to forget that early research was risky. And so what my blog does is it goes through and it documents. It's based off of an editorial published in JAMA in the 1920s called The Martyrs of Medicine. And it lists various physicians and researchers who are all male who died as a result of their own self-experimentation to try to find vaccines or cures for illness. So I talk about this within this whole narrative of underrepresentation of females, and then also just trying to give a positive message about men and masculinity. So I think there's just a lack of respect and appreciation for what a lot of men have done over the years. And this is a way to kind of give respect, to those researchers from earlier generations.
Yeah, and the fact that, obviously there will have been some women, presumably along the way, who've taken similar risks, but it's predominantly men, and taking risks is a wonderful male characteristic, as we know, and it's no longer celebrated. So I was very pleased to see you doing that, James. And the other thing I noticed I should mention is the fact that you've been involved with Warren Farrell in recently writing a letter to the White House calling for more attention to boys and men's health. Warren's been battling on trying to get the White House to take notice on this issue for a while. How did you get involved with that?
Well, I got introduced to that group, that coalition, through Tom Golden, who I think is someone that you probably know. I've been interviewed on Tom's Men Are Good show a couple of times. I love catching up with Tom. And Tom's a part of that group, and Tom was a part of that letter, and we came together as a group. And what happened was the Biden White House announced, so they already had a gender policy council in place, and then they announced this further push towards additional offices for research on women's health. Yeah. Now, there already exist several offices for research on women's health within the NIH and CDC and so on and so forth, and now they want more. And so our letter was just putting together the rationale for why you should be interested in boys and men's health. We have several key bullet points, starting with the life expectancy difference, which is around 6 years now, and going to everything from, death by various causes, the problem of suicide, and the huge economic cost that ignoring boys and men's health actually has to society as well. Yeah,
of course, we're seeing a big push in that direction in Australia, with our Labor government very keen on doing everything they can for women and nothing for men. Look, James, I think you're doing a heroic job out there. And I'm really excited to, start following your Substack blogs and also your podcast. And I hope lots of other people will get on board and keep track of the efforts you're making to call out this ideological attack we're all suffering. Thanks for joining me today. It's been great to talk to you, James.
Thanks so much, Bettina. I really appreciate it.
Great.